Hello and welcome to Our American States, a podcast from the National Conference of State Legislatures. I'm your host, Ed Smith.
This is a national security issue. We have more than 100 co-ops that are serving more than 100 military installations across the country. So an impact to co-op services can have a real effect on our ability to respond during a national security event.
That was John Ransom, Director of Regulatory Affairs for Grid Security for the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, and one of my guests on this episode. He's joined by Adrienne Lotto, Senior Vice President for Grid Security at the American Public Power Association. Electrical co-ops and public power utilities provide service to about 100 million Americans, including many rural parts of the nation and counties with persistent poverty. They have many of the same concerns about both physical and cybersecurity as investor-owned utilities, but different challenges in terms of terrain, staffing, and resources. John and Adrienne discuss some of those unique challenges, how they work with state regulators, and how something like high turnover in state energy offices can complicate their efforts. Here's our discussion. Adrienne, John, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having us.
Glad to be here.
Let me start by asking each of you to just talk briefly about your organization and your role there. And Adrienne, why don't you go ahead and start?
Thanks, Ed. I represent the American Public Power Association, wherein we represent about 1,400 municipal utilities across all 49 states, excluding Alaska. Our members are community-owned electric systems, and we also represent the U.S. territories. So that includes Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, WAPA, as well as remote areas, including Guam Power Authority. So our membership is fairly diverse.
And John, why don't you tell us a little bit about the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association and your role there?
Sure. So NRECA is the National Trade Association representing about 900 local electric cooperatives. Our members are providing power to about 42 million Americans across 56% of the country. And that's everything from suburbs to farming communities. Like the municipals, co-ops are not-for-profit. We are owned by the people that we serve. So the people that are getting power in those suburbs and those farming communities are the same ones that own that infrastructure. In my role with NRECA, I serve as a Director of Regulatory Affairs, covering cyber and physical security issues, which means that when there are new policies, regulations coming out at the federal level, we're working with energy, homeland security, et cetera, to ensure that they're considering the unique needs of electric cooperatives in those government actions that they're doing.
Well, John, let me stick with you for a minute. We're talking today, of course, about security for facilities in rural parts of the country. And I wonder if you could talk about that, what the strengths and weaknesses are.
I think the first thing that I would say is that with 900 members, there's not really a universal truth to the strengths and weaknesses across all of those members, but I think we do see some common themes in a lot of, across a lot of them. There are some challenges working in rural America. The regions that they're serving are often more sparsely populated. That means they require more infrastructure per consumer. That's more transmission lines, more substations that they need to patrol, to monitor. A lot of this infrastructure is located in very remote or isolated areas. Many times those cooperatives are trying to do all of that with a smaller staff. People are wearing multiple hats in many instances. Given the not-for-profit business model, it means that we don't necessarily have access to a lot of the same resources for funding that some of our larger counterparts may have. So every dollar that we spend is really passed along to consumers at the end of the line. On the flip side of that, though, not having a profit incentive means that we're able to focus on some of those core issues that our members really prioritize, things like reliability and affordability. That's especially important given that cooperatives serve 92% of persistent poverty counties. So keeping prices affordable is a major focus for us. When we think about strengths, I think the biggest thing that comes to my mind is the collaborative nature that cooperatives have. Cooperatives talk to each other. they share information, they share lessons learned. One of the core values that we have as a cooperative family is really co-ops helping co-ops in a spirit of mutual assistance. That means we're sharing resources and expertise, and not just in things like storm restoration, where a lot of people send crews halfway across the country to support a response effort. It also includes things like pooling resources to get better access to things like safety training, IT services, marketing and comms, etc. And then the last thing that I would add there is, given that we are owned by the people that we serve, there's a strong community focus for cooperatives. Our boards of directors are made up of those members that are end of the line power customers. So those decisions that they're making at the leadership level tend to serve the interests not only of the membership, the cooperative membership, but also just the broader community. This means that we're building trust with our members, and when it comes to things like justifying investments, it's easier for us to make that case because you have somebody that you trust coming to you.
And Adrienne, what's your perspective, the security and public power utilities position? What are some of the strengths and weaknesses there?
John articulated a lot of them very, very well. It is substantially similar for our American Public Power Association members. The membership is very diverse at APPA. And so to the question of what's the security posture, I would agree that there are a number of challenges, but also there is a collaborative effort that the municipalities utilize. Working across sometimes very remote footprint is difficult. The terrain itself can be difficult. Even communications can be difficult. Our utility workers and the workforce is often in remote areas where there is no cell service. I would also add workforce challenges. Workforce and getting skilled labor and people interested in working inside an electric municipal utility is at times a challenge, and our members are always trying to think of new and innovative ideas to get younger people interested in the electric sector, in public power, and we've done with them a lot of work in that area. And then, as John articulated well, likewise, we have a mutual aid program wherein if a storm does occur, or I should say when storms do occur, there's really a call to action. For example, most recently, we had members all the way from the upper Northeast last year traveling all the way down into the Carolinas to support after Hurricane Milton and Helene. I believe that is truly one of the most important parts of that resiliency and community in terms of public power that make the difference.
Adrienne, let me stick with you for a second. Are there specific challenges to the rural areas, and I think you alluded to this, around security, that are different from more urban areas, maybe things that a lot of listeners might be more familiar with?
I think, as we intimated earlier, the remote nature of the grid, the diversity upon which some of that infrastructure is built and exists can become quite challenging. If you have a utility in New York City, a squirrel is probably the most dangerous thing that could happen and often causes outages. We'll often see from the EISAC, the Electricity Information Sharing Analysis Center, regularly you'll receive an alert, shots have been heard out and around infrastructure. More often than not, those remote areas are just individuals hunting. But nonetheless, when you're operating around critical infrastructure, that can be a threat and something that we tend to look at and tend to spend some time and focus on. I also think the perimeter is changing around the grid. It used to be guns, gates, and guards, right? A nuclear power plant in a particular area, you have guns, gates, and guards, and that secures it. As distributed energy resources are proliferating the grid, we see more infrastructure in more remote parts of the grid that need additional security. So just thinking through staffing, capital planning on how to protect those areas, I think the use of technology also becomes critically important. You may not have an individual out by that site, but things like utilization of cameras, motion detection, that is also what our utilities are utilizing to reduce cost, but keep the grid secure. So I think continuing facing those challenges, I think the municipalities and our members are certainly up for it, but it's an ever evolving, moving target.
John, let me ask you, in your role working in regulatory affairs, given all these unique challenges, I think it's fair to say that facilities in these rural areas experience, how does that affect how you work with legislators, with state regulators, in terms of trying to get them to appreciate the very things that we were just talking about and help you with response, cybersecurity, risk analysis, that sort of thing?
So I think what it really comes down to is starting at the basics and to build on something that Adrienne said, just recognizing the diversity between all of the different utilities. IOUs have a very different set of priorities than the municipalities. We're going to have a different set of priorities than the co-ops. That doesn't mean that there is an overlap between all of them. But even within just the cooperatives, priorities are going to be different from one utility to the next. So that means that when it comes to the state, the folks in state government, they really need to be working to build a relationship with the cooperatives and vice versa in those states so that they can not only understand what those differences between them are, but why they're important. You mentioned assessing risk. When it comes to risk assessments, we feel really strongly that needs to be risk informed. Every utility is going to have a different set of threats that they're focused on, either based on their size, the customers that they're serving, if they serve a military base or something of that nature, where they're getting their energy from, et cetera, how their systems are designed. That means that how they address that risk is going to be different in every instance as well. There's always different ways to reduce risk. The solution that you choose for your utility needs to represent the operational environment that you're working in. And so giving those operators the flexibility to find that solution that best fits their needs is really critical. I know you also mentioned response and coordination, and just a quick plug there as well. States can help improve that as well by kind of bringing some of those utility members into things like state-sponsored trainings and exercises. This lets industry and government build relationships with their counterparts before an incident happens, so that when that bad day arrives, you're not exchanging business cards in the emergency operations center.
So, John, let me stick with you for a second. So when states do hand down these mandates, whether around security and that sort of thing, are they responsive to the fact that co-ops and municipals are significantly different from the investor-owned utilities? Are you folks successful in getting them to give you leeway on that, or how is that working out?
I mean, unfortunately, the answer depends. It varies from state to state. But one of the things that we notice, I think, is that it really comes back to my earlier point about understanding those differences between the utilities. Because when it comes to something like cyber resources, you have guidelines, frameworks, and standards that are designed to be kind of a one-size-fits-all solution for infrastructure operators, and that includes a lot of security service or security solutions that may be targeted to large, well-resourced operators that have an extensive cyber team and a lot of funding available to support it. That doesn't necessarily mean that those big expensive items, the new technology, a deep bench of cyber personnel, or cyber vendors, threat feeds, and the like, are the best solution in every instance. Because ultimately, as I had noted earlier, there's multiple ways that you can secure your systems. And so that may just mean limiting the number of devices that can be accessed remotely, limiting the number of personnel that can access the terminals that can access those devices, having something as basic as a cyber response plan or training for your employees. These are all things that are really effective in buying down risk. Working with those state government officials to help them understand how viable some of those solutions are, and that you don't need to have the gold-plated solution in every instance to adequately secure your system. You can do that with a lot of common sense mitigation measures that address the risks that you're seeing.
We'll be right back after this short break with the rest of our discussion.
NCSL is bringing the Legislative Summit back to Boston. Join us August 4th through the 6th to connect with legislators and staff from across the nation at an event jam-packed with great speakers, eye-opening policy sessions, and after-hours experiences at some of Boston's coolest venues. Help NCSL celebrate its 50th anniversary in style. Register today.
I'm back with John Ransom from the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association and Adrienne Lotto with the American Public Power Association. Adrienne, I wanted to ask you, along the same lines as John was talking about before the break, how your members approach these security issues, given that they too have more limited resources than the larger investor-owned utilities.
I think John hit on a number of them. Most states now have some sort of a state energy office wherein our utilities are directly working with their state energy offices, both on a blue sky day, as well as then to ensure, as John said, relationships during an event should they occur. So in terms of state energy offices, I think the challenge there remains that oftentimes we see a high level of turnover in the state energy offices with state officials. So while the relationship may be established because the political nature of people turning over in the state energy offices as a result of changing of elections, it's really important, as John mentioned, to continue to build those relationships over time. A lot of state energy offices, if they're not, should be participating regularly with the utilities in their exercises. Certainly, last but not least, I think John articulated well regarding risk appetite. Each utility has a different risk appetite that is often informed by the customers, what they're serving, whether or not they're in a PUC or not. Are they a larger system or a smaller system? Are they regulated or are they not? And so continuing to understand that mitigating risk mitigation efforts include a variety of approaches, whether or not it's training or technology. It depends on what the risk is that we're attempting to mitigate. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
And Adrienne, in your experience with these state energy offices, and that's a very interesting point, that turnover has such a significant effect on the relationships. Do you find flexibility, at least in some places, in terms of how the municipals and co-ops should respond as opposed to the investor-owned utilities?
Our members work very closely because they are community owned. They work very closely with their state officials. Again, I think it's really important that the relationships and the transfer of knowledge occur on a regular basis. Understanding, as you mentioned earlier, that there may be limited resources, that the cybersecurity risk is continuing to grow and evolve, that additional controls are usually being implemented on a regular basis by the utilities, that physical security risks may be different in remote areas and mitigated differently than in a more densely populated area. You know, there's a saying when we talk about physical security, oh, just build a 6-foot fence around it. Great, I'll bring an 8-foot ladder.
And John, if you had to drill down, what would you say is the biggest logistical or financial obstacle that utilities in rural areas face for both their physical safety, their physical infrastructure, and their cyber infrastructure?
Adrienne did a great job of noting a couple of those issues, and I think that those they're very similar on the co-op side as well when it comes to things like thinking ahead for investments to things like physical security. But what it comes down to ultimately is that, as I noted before, any investment is going to represent a cost that is passed on to people at the end of the line. But we have to make investments in these things. So how do we ensure that we're making the right decisions, the smart decisions that are representing the best value for the co-op? And again, that comes full circle to using the risk calculus that is appropriate to your entity. And when it comes to a lot of costs, many of these things aren't necessarily one-off either. They require persistent funding. So again, from the cyber perspective, hiring new staff and personnel subscribing to threat feeds. These are all expensive investments. So any ways that we can find to do things like broaden access to services through resource pooling, sharing information and threat intel, we need to have a lot of these in our toolbox so that we can offset some of those costs, so that we can take advantage of the benefits that they give without making them inaccessible to some of the smaller utilities. The other thing I'd say is to hit on something that Adrienne mentioned earlier. Workforce in rural areas is always a persistent challenge for us. It's typically harder to recruit talent to rural areas because they're further away from the concentrations of trained personnel. It can be really difficult to incentivize people to move out to rural areas that may not have access to the same salary ranges or the range of services that they might find in a larger city. Trying to bring some of that training and workforce development out to the areas where they're needed will help reduce the distance between that talent pipeline and the areas where that talent is needed the most.
John, another question I wanted to ask you, and this is probably sort of like burying the lead. I used to be a journalist, and maybe I could ask this question first. What's at stake here? What's at stake if we do not adequately provide this sort of security for these utilities?
That's a great question. And I mean, I don't think that it's hyperbole to say that this is a national security issue. We have more than 100 co-ops that are serving more than 100 military installations across the country. So an impact to co-op services can have a real effect on our ability to respond during a national security event. But more broadly than that, what does this mean for everyday citizens? When the power goes out, people are at greater risk. You have medically dependent populations that require electricity for medical devices. You have at-risk populations that are more susceptible in extreme heat and cold events. And then you have just the everyday things that we take for granted, everything from street lamps to stoplights. When the power goes out, risk goes up. We live in a society that's incredibly dependent on electricity for the sake of our economic and personal safety. I mean, it's important to minimize those outages any way that we can.
I'd like to ask each of you as we close here what your message would be to state legislators, maybe other state government officials, about how they can best support rural utilities in terms of securing the infrastructure. And John, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. So to keep the theme of my that I've been following here with a lot of my comments, it's get to know the utilities in your state, build a relationship with them. For our cooperatives, many of them have statewide associations, which are a great entry point to help make some of those connections with those utilities. If your state is considering a bill that will impact the energy sector within the state, bring some of those stakeholders that will be impacted by it to the table so that you can factor in those unique perspectives. Again, recognizing that it's not the energy industry, it's many different stakeholder groups within that industry group. When you're considering new requirements, especially for something like cybersecurity, ensure that they're aligned with existing resources and guidelines. It'll not only help facilitate compliance on the utility side because they'll be working with something that they're more familiar with. It'll also help with things like harmonizing those requirements down the road with other requirements so that when an incident occurs, we're minimizing the administrative and compliance burden on cyber teams so that they can keep focused on addressing the problem at hand and keeping the lights on.
And Adrienne, really the same question to you, and you get the last word here.
Well, thanks, Ed, first of all, for having me. I really appreciate it. I think my colleague John articulated it quite well. My advice would be to communicate often. I would include with the entire ecosystem of decision makers, stakeholders, not just within the state government itself, but truly, as John said, reach out to the utilities within the footprint, ensure that you have a good relationship with them. If it's on the regulatory side, get to know who that person is within the utility. If it's on the emergency response side, get to understand who that person is. If it's on the safety side, make sure you understand who that person is. Maybe it's all the same person, but nonetheless, it could be different people. So Communicating often and frequently is the key. As we say here in Washington, D.C., make sure you have those decision makers around the table, because it's better to be at the table than on the menu.
Well, I want to thank you both. This is such a critically important issue, and I think that you both did a great job of explaining not only the dimensions of it, but also some of the unique characteristics of it. I appreciate you taking the time. Take care.
Thanks, Ed.
I've been talking with John Ransom of the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association and Adrienne Lotto of the American Public Power Association about the unique challenges of securing the nation's rural utilities. Thanks for listening. You can check out all the podcasts from the National Conference of State Legislatures by searching for NCSL Podcasts wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast, Our American States, dives into some of the most challenging public policy issues facing legislators. On Across the Aisle, host Kelly Griffin tells stories of bipartisanship. Also check out our special series, Building Democracy, on the history of legislatures.